Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to Round 8 coverage of the Zurich 1953 Candidates Tournament. For Round 8, I selected the game Reshevsky against Kotov to take a look at. Reshevsky, we talked about before, Samuel Reshevsky, the only player from the United States in the tournament. And with the black pieces, Alexander Kotov. I've also talked about him before, a Russian player and author of the book Think Like a Grandmaster. So Reshevsky kicks off with d4. And we get into a King's Indian defense by a little bit of an unusual move order, starting with d6. White just continues to develop normally, waiting to see how black is going to set things up, I guess. Knight bd7 and knight f3 and g6. Now we got the traditional King's Indian setup where e5 or c5 could be played, and both would be considered part of the King's Indian family, although the c5 setup typically is known as a Bedoni structure. So e4, e5, and bishop e2, bishop g7. So this is a classical King's Indian. Let's go ahead and put on the next moves. Castles, castles. So some interesting points about this position. I guess normally the knight, more often the knight comes out to c6 instead of d7. But on d7 it doesn't block the c-pawn, and it's not subject to this tempo-gaining push d5. But on the other hand, it's not putting as much pressure on the center. It's just hitting these squares. From d7 it hits e5 and c5. It doesn't put any pressure on d4 like it would from c6. So pros and cons. It's not going to get pushed away from that square anytime soon, but it's not attacking the center either. This is similar to the game in round 7, where knight bd7 was also played, but in that game White had set up a fianchetto system instead of the classical system that Reshevsky uses here. So rook e1 was played, just putting rook on a central file, and now c6. So this is one of the advantages of putting the knight on d7, is it doesn't block the c-pawn and allows that to come forward. Now Reshevsky plays a bit of an unusual move, bishop f1, retreating the bishop back. It's a very solid way to play. This bishop is going to defend the squares in front of the king, and it's preparing in case black wants to launch a kingside attack here. White is already set to defend against it. On the other hand, black hasn't started his kingside attack and is not committed to it as yet. And in fact, black plays a really unusual move here. He plays knight to e8. So the more typical moves here are e takes d4, opening up the diagonal for the bishop, like we saw in the previous game from round 7. This bishop can become very powerful. The other idea in this position for black is pawn to a4, just forestalling some of White's play on the queen side, preparing to exchange off the pawn on b4 when it shows up there. Because having castled king side, White very often expands on the queen side here and tries to inflict damage on the queen side pawns or the center. What Kotov came up with in this position, though, was a new plan, going knight e8 to c7 to e6, taking 3 moves to move the knight 1 square, but maybe rerouting it to a square that's perhaps more useful. It's got more central influence with putting some pressure on both d4 and f4, and maybe the knight at f4 could jump in and participate in an attack at some point. The problem with it is a bit slow, and White has the opportunity to play some moves in the meantime while black is rerouting his knight. And so I haven't this game has not shown up in the database since then. So I think the judgment of the subsequent grandmasters is this wasn't the best idea. But well, White continues with his plan of queenside expansion with rook b1, preparing b4 and knight c7. Now b4. So both sides proceeding with their plans independently. And now at this point, Kotov had second thoughts about the move knight e6. According to Bronstein, if he plays this right away, he calculated this variation where if the knight comes to e6, White can push on with d5. That's pretty obvious. That's going to happen. There's an exchange here. No, not the exchange. His plan was to play knight to d4, and after this exchange, knight takes, pawn takes, and now knight e2, hitting the pawn on d4. It can be defended with c5, and then after further exchanges, in this position, White can play the move f4, and his king is fairly secure along this diagonal, which has just been opened up, and there's a pretty formidable looking armada of pawns in the center. So the chess engine, I have to say, thinks that black can defend this position, but Kotov, in his calculations, when he reached this point, he looked ahead this far and he said, I don't like the looks of that with all those pawns crashing through the center there. So he decided to take a time out from his plan and play the move c5. But this allows white to open up the center in a favorable way. So starting with d takes c5, d takes, and now bishop to a3. So one of the points of this rook a1 move and b4 is that white didn't prepare the b4 push with the move a3. So he just went b4 right away and the rook supporting it. So this square a3 was available for the bishop, and this looks like a good diagonal for the bishop, so it seems like white's got a decent position here. Now black continues with this plan of knight e6, which is also useful for supporting the c-pawn. And white just takes the pawn. And black doesn't take back right away. He was a bit concerned about the line where after knight takes pawn, queen to d5, hitting the knight, and the knight is under some pressure because there's a pin on this diagonal now. After knight takes pawn, the bishop has pinned the knight to the rook, and the queen to d5 puts more pressure on the knight. So instead he threw in the move rook e8, just getting away from that pin. In this position, Sammy continues with knight d5, knight b5, and now he takes the pawn with the knight on d7. And Reshevsky plays queen d5, a good move, centralizing the queen. And notice that actually black can't take the queen. If you want to take a minute to think about it, there's one of your quiz positions here. Why can't black play queen takes queen here? Okay, I'm going to give the answer away. After queen takes queen, there's pawn takes queen, and now two knights are under attack. This knight and this knight. And so when this knight moves, this knight will fall, or this knight, and if this knight doesn't move, then he's just going to be taken by a pawn. So there's no defense here, and black is just losing a piece. So the queen on d5 is quite stable, and black here plays the move knight a4. An interesting and tactical move with the idea at some point of coming into c3 and forking the queen and the rook. Now right now the c3 square is guarded by this knight on b5, but of course black can always kick it with a6 and then fork the queen and the rook. So it's interesting that the chess engine, now Reshevsky just played rook to b3. Very sensible move. Just defending against this square, so if the knight gets kicked, it can go to d6, which is where he wants to put it anyway, bringing it in for the attack. But what's interesting is that the chess engine finds a move here. This was not pointed out by Bronstein, but was found by my chess engine, which is that white does not actually have to defend against this threat of c3. He can continue the attack and just grab this pawn here on e5. And if white tries to, and if black tries to carry out the threat, kicking the knight goes to d6, and now knight c3, forking the queen and the rook. There's a nice move from white here, which is knight takes f7, hitting the queen. And the knight is defended by the knight on d6, so it can't be taken. So that was a free pawn there. And now with both queens under attack, if you just continue down trading, white ends up material. So like, what's black's move? Black takes the queen, then white's going to take the queen, and then it's black's move. He can save one of his knights, or he can take the knight. The engine likes this move best, also because it hits the other knight, I suppose. But that knight is defended by the rook, and now e takes d5, and this knight is under attack and is going to have to move. So if we count the pieces, the number of pieces is the same, but White has 2 extra pawns. There's 6 pawns against 4. And these are 2 pretty good-looking pawns here. They're connected in the center. So White is just winning this position. So that's no good after knight takes f7. And the queen is under attack, so if he doesn't take the queen, he has to move his queen away. The best try is queen to h4. But after this, White can just drop his queen back to d3. And once again, everything's protected here. The material's even in terms of pieces, but White is 2 pawns up. He's 6 pawns to 4. And his pieces, I guess the knights look like they might be a bit tangled up, but let's see. Well, lots of things are hanging here, too. I shouldn't forget that. This rook is under threat. This rook is under threat. So the most likely way it would continue from here is knight takes rook, knight takes rook, knight takes bishop. Black can continue taking stuff, but so can White. Knight takes bishop. And now king takes knight. Every move a piece goes. And it's White's turn. Knight takes e6, and bishop takes. So at the end of all this, there's a queen, a rook, and a bishop for White. Oh, of course, it wasn't the end yet. Queen takes there. A queen, a rook, and a bishop for White, and a queen, a rook, and a bishop for Black. It's Black's turn to move, but all the pawns are defended. That's defended by the bishop, that's defended by the rook. And once again, White has 2 extra pawns. And with the reduced material on the board, should be an easy win. So that's probably a little bit deep. Although sometimes, I've said this before, sometimes grandmasters can calculate lines like that. But in this case, neither Reshevsky nor Kotov nor Bronstein noticed that one. So rook to b3 was played. And now, White's got an edge here, but it's not overwhelming. So nobody has made any critical mistakes yet. Black continues with knight to b6, kicking the queen. Queen drops back to d1. And bishop d7. So getting his last piece off the back rank, hitting the knight here on b4. And Reshevsky pushes on with c5. So rather than defending his knight, he's counterattacking Black's knight. It's interesting how often grandmasters do this. They don't like to play retreating moves. They like to keep things moving forward. And now, I should also point out that the knight is defended, so the bishop is holding onto the knight. So Black really can't trade here. He's got to do something about his knight. The interesting thing is the best move for the knight is to go back to a4, the square it just came from, reintroducing this threat of knight to c3. And actually, that's not the main idea. I think the main idea here is putting pressure on the c5 pawn. So it's not really easy to defend that pawn. And it's not easy to get pressure on the knight either. For example, the knight looks like it's sort of loose there, but you can't play rook to b4 chasing the knight, because the knight can just grab the pawn. The best try here, White can continue on his plan of knight d6, and now knight takes c5 can be played here, hitting the rook. So there's 2 rooks under threat once again, and this is enough to maintain that the knight on a4 there for a while. So that would have been a way to play. After c5, instead, Black played the retreating move, knight to c8, and this turns out to be nearly a winning advantage for White, although it's still a complicated game. But Reshevsky plays in a very direct fashion. So rook d3, putting pressure on the center, and Kotov blocked it with the move knight to d4. And now this is losing a pawn here, so almost by force, White is up a pawn at this point. Pawn takes, and now White takes back with the knight here. What's interesting, and this is something that was not commented on by Bronstein either, but was also discovered by my chess engine. But I think this is the kind of thing that can be discovered in the course of a normal chess game. It's actually okay to take this pawn with the rook, and I think it's kind of instructive to see this. So if rook takes d4, bishop takes, so you're giving up the exchange. It's an exchange sacrifice. But what you've got here is an open diagonal towards your opponent's king, and you have a dark squared bishop. as well as the queen already sitting on that diagonal, and black had to give up his dark squared bishop to defend against that. So bishop e6 is best, opening up the line against the queen. Queen drops back to c3, also attacking the pawn here. Now f6 to block this diagonal, and bishop b2. And so in this position, if we count the material, black is up the exchange, but white has one pawn for the exchange, and he has the bishop pair. So that's usually enough compensation for an exchange, having a pawn plus the bishop pair. And he's got a lot of pressure on black's king side, and he has ideas to increase the pressure with moves like knight to b5, knight to g5, for example. So that would be an interesting way to play for white. Now Reshevsky played more simply in this position. He just took the pawn with his knight, and so he's 2 pawns up. No, just 1 pawn up. But he has a good position here. Black has been driven back to kind of a defensive formation, so it's a pawn plus a good position. So he's pretty much in the driver's seat here. Kotov tries to mix things up with the move queen a5, getting active and maybe putting some pressure on the c-pawn. Knight to b3, hitting the queen, protecting the pawn. And also, this is a trade. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that. The queen comes out here and hits the bishop. And with this move knight b3, this is a double attack on the queen and the bishop on d7. So this trade of bishops, black gets the dark squared bishop, white gets the light squared bishop, leaving black with a good bishop. But what white is playing for in this position is a somewhat awkward position of black's knight, as well as being a pawn up. So this is still keeping the advantage for white. So after rook takes d7, knight e7 was played. Notice how these squares were controlled by the pawn, and even on e7 these squares are controlled by the other pawn. So difficult for that knight to find useful employment. And he was able to get his knight going, but at the cost of a pawn. Though, black recovers a pawn here on a2. And now bishop to b5 was played. There's an improvement here. That this is one that Bronstein suggested. Rather than go bishop to b5 immediately, it's better to play queen f3 first. And then the idea of playing bishop to c4. So for example, if rook a to b8 attacking the rook a to b8, then bishop to c4 can be played. And now there's this killer threat on f7, and black doesn't even have time to take the pawn. Let's see, king h8 is a recommended move, just giving up on f7. So that's one way to play. After queen f3, it's possible for black to play queen to a4 and try and defend against this bishop to c4 threat. But now bishop to b5 can be played. And this is a strong move because it forks the queen and the rook. And so white's winning some material here. So queen f3 would have been an interesting and perhaps more forceful way to play. I wouldn't be surprised if Reshevsky was already in a bit of time trouble and just trying to find simple moves that keep the advantage at this point. There's a mention of time trouble later in the game. We'll get to it. It's kind of interesting. So bishop to b5 was played. Rook e to d8, hitting the queen. The queen now goes to f3. And now this bishop could drop back to c4 and put pressure there. Bishop to f8 was played. Maybe preparing to move the pawn forward and also defending the knight. Bishop to c4, defending his knight and maybe in a way indirectly threatening the queen. The queen goes to b2. Well, this bishop was loose here, so it's not clear that was immediately an immediate threat. But I think the idea with the queen on this diagonal is it wants to be able to come back and defend. So black has given up another pawn here because the queen can just take on f7, and now the king has to run to the corner. And then the move e5 was played. And now it's at this point. There was a note by Bronstein here. It says, It says the rest of this game was played in unbelievable time pressure. Reshevsky had literally seconds left, Kotov a few minutes. Under these circumstances, Kotov found a swindle which almost turned the game around. So that's you have to remember, in those days there was no delay or increment on the clock. So when you ran out of time, that was it was all over. We're on move 30, and he's got 12 moves to make. To the time control is at move 42 in this tournament, an odd time control. So he's got 12 moves to make the time control, and he's got seconds on his clock. So he pounds out e5. These are still good moves, by the way. Black plays queen c3, hitting the bishop, and hitting the rook. I'm sorry, the bishop is protected by the queen, and the bishop defends the knight, but the queen to c3 hits the rook. So the king goes to f1 to defend the rook. Now rook a to b8 was played, and white pushes on with c6, defending his rook. And now rook b to c8, hitting the pawn that was just played to c6. And now bishop to e6, hitting the rook. And in this position, with the bishop out of the way, black plays queen d3. This is the start of his trick. King to g1 and queen to e2. One of those fantastic moves. So, of course, white can't take the queen. The queen's perfectly safe there because the rook will come down and checkmate. So there are threats here. And of course, Reshevsky still has seconds on his clock, one assumes. It's either that or it's gone to zero. It's interesting that a defensive move like rook f1 is not the best move here. It's quite dangerous. So rook f1, and black has the move rook d1, threatening rook takes, checkmate, right? So knight d2, defending the rook. Now the queen takes the knight, and now bishop to c4, defending the rook. So it is possible to defend, just barely. But after rook takes, of course, white can't take with the king because queen to d1 there is checkmate. So he has to take back with the bishop. And now queen to g5. And if we pause at this position and count, actually black is a piece up here. Black has a knight, queen, rook, bishop, knight versus queen, rook, bishop. And in compensation, white has two extra pawns, those two and those two against those two. So the two extra pawns, actually, so from a material point of view, black is ahead, but white, because these pawns are so far advanced, white still has an advantage here, but black has chances, particularly in time pressure. So in this position, if you want to take a second and see what you would play as white, there's one move here that white found that continues to win. Okay, if you want to think about that for a while, you can pause the video, although you have to remember Reshevsky just had a few seconds on his clock. Reshevsky played queen takes f8 check, giving up his queen, but he gets enough material here, you'll see. Actually, the main idea is to distract this rook so that black's queen can be taken, and this is all done with check. So Bronstein had another note here, which I thought was interesting. It said, Reshevsky seized his head in his hands, glanced nervously at his flag, which was ready to fall at any moment, and the position. So that means there's less than 5 seconds left. And the position, and took the bishop with check. Then Reshevsky asked how many moves had been made, which is not acceptable grandmaster practice, and received an answer from one of the spectators, which is really illegal. So that's true. You're not supposed to say anything to give some help. Although I think you are allowed in cases like this to pause the clock and ask for help from an arbiter. But I don't know what the rules were in those days. In any case, an intense situation, and he was on move 35, so he still had 7 moves to go to make the time control in less than 5 seconds, so he had to slam out the rest of these moves. But I'm sure he had calculated it all out to this safe position. So rook takes is forced. The king is in check and has no moves. And now white can just grab the queen. And if you look at it, he's 2 pieces. Oh, he's 1 piece up, but he's got extra pawns here. Black starts trying to cause trouble by grabbing pawns, but he gives up another piece here. and then he starts pushing his pawn forward. So I think these moves maybe don't make so much sense. It was just Kotov was just playing out the clock here and seeing if Reshevsky could make the time control. He pushes his pawn, the knight moves. He plays rook to c1 check. The king goes to h2. And rook to d1, hitting the knight. The knight went to b5, so cancel that. The knight went to b5. Yeah, so remember, Reshevsky, he's got to make these moves, but he's also got to maintain his advantage. He can't just give the game away in the next few moves. Kotov plays rook to b1, hitting the knight. And the knight goes to d6, back where it came from. And at this point, we're on move 42. He made the time control, and Kotov resigned. So that's how it ended. So after 8 rounds, Reshevsky has got 6 points with this win. 6 out of 8 is a pretty good score, particularly at this level of confidence. At this level of competition. So his closest competitor, Smyslov, who was tied with him in the previous round, Smyslov had a bye. So remember, there's 15 players, and so every round one player has a bye, and this was Smyslov's turn to have the bye. So he's still at 5 points, although he'll get an extra game in the next 7 rounds to catch up. So also at 5 points was Paul Keres, and behind them at 4.5 were Miguel Najdorf and Max Erba. So a solid lead for Reshevsky, although Smyslov and those other players are still in the running, depending on who has buys coming up and who's playing out the remaining rounds in the first half of the tournament. That's where things stand. Stay tuned. I'll be back for round 9 coverage. See you then. Bye.